Hey everyone, this is Max, one of the creators of Ionic. Today we're going to walk through building our very first mobile app with the new version of Ionic, Ionic 2. We'll walk through installing all the dependencies needed to build apps with Ionic. We'll start a new Ionic app and make some small modifications. We'll talk about documentation and resources that you'll need when you build your app. And then we'll talk about where to go from here. For those new to Ionic, Ionic is an open source HTML5 and native mobile app development framework that helps developers build mobile apps for all the major platforms and even the mobile web and desktop using the exact same code base. We built Ionic for web developers who were new to mobile or wanted to use their existing skill sets to build mobile apps. Building apps with Ionic is very similar to building a traditional website. We use HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and instead of getting a traditional site out of it, we get what looks and feels more like a mobile app that users are familiar with. One of the big reasons we built Ionic was to empower web developers to become mobile developers without having to learn a totally new technology stack. Additionally, Ionic comes with some very useful tools to help you build, test, and scale your app. The command line tool is how you start new projects, build, test, and actually work on your app. Ionic Creator is a visual design tool that helps people who aren't comfortable coding or want to really quickly build UI using our drag and drop tool. Ionic Cloud Services help you easily add things like user authentication and push notifications to your Ionic app. And Ionic Native helps you add the full power of the native SDKs to your app, including things like Bluetooth, fingerprint scanning, and a whole lot more. Finally, the Ionic View app helps you test and share your app with clients, coworkers, friends, you name it, without requiring them to deal with complicated beta provisioning and testing. You just share the app with them, they install Ionic View, and they test it. It also is an easy way for you to test your app on your device without having to install the SDKs. Definitely check out Ionic View, it's totally free. Let's install Ionic and get started building our first mobile app. Open your browser to ionicframework.com and then click Get Started. The first thing that we need to do, if we haven't done it already, is install Node.js. If you're not familiar with Node.js, it's a popular and fast-growing project that enables developers to build command line tools, web servers, and libraries using JavaScript. Once you have it installed, you'll be able to use it for a ton of projects, not just Ionic, as it's quickly becoming the de facto standard for JavaScript utilities and libraries. When installing Node.js, pick the LTS or long-term support version. Same thing if you're upgrading. Generally, Ionic always supports the latest LTS version, and it's the most stable and widely used. Unfortunately, we can't always guarantee that we support the current version due to large changes that aren't yet supported. So once we've installed Node.js, the next thing that we need to do is install Cordova and Ionic. So we'll just go and copy this command, and we'll go to our terminal, and we'll type it in. Note, if we're on Linux or Mac, we need to add sudo first in order to install these utilities globally. Sudo is not required, nor will it work on Windows, so please leave it out when you run that command. Great, Cordova and Ionic are now installed. So the Ionic CLI is what we use to start, test, and run our Ionic apps. So now that we have it installed, let's go ahead and create our very first Ionic app. To do this, we'll use a start option for the Ionic CLI, along with the name of the app that we want to create. Ionic Start My App. And then we need to add the special v2 flag, which is 2 dashes and then v2, which tells Ionic that we're going to be creating a version 2 project. If we leave that out, it'll create a version 1 project, so make sure you put it in. Soon this will become the default, but either way it'll work. This command takes a little bit as it's downloading all the initial app code as well as installing the dependencies that our app needs, like AngularJS. Great, it's finished. So once that command completes, we will have a full Ionic app in the directory with the name that we just gave our app above. So if we type LL or LS, we can see that we have a My App directory. We need to CD into that directory. CD means change directory. It's equivalent to, say, navigating to a folder in Finder or Windows Explorer. So once we're in there, we can just do a quick ls-l to see the files in the app structure that we have. So before we dig in, let's just run our app and see it live. Type Ionic Lab, which will run Ionic in a special testing environment that lets us preview various device platforms side by side. You can also substitute the word lab for serve to just run the app full screen with the default platform. So here we have lab, it's running, and we're previewing the iPhone version. But we can also go and toggle Android or Windows to see how Ionic adapts the UI for different platforms automatically. Okay, now our app is running. Let's go and take a look at the code that's been generated for our app. So you'll want to go and open your text editor to the folder that we just created. So I use Atom. We also recommend Visual Studio Code is a great option. Either way, you'll want to go and open that folder in your text editor. So if you're using Atom, just go in the directory and type Atom space period. It'll open Atom and use that current directory as the project folder. So here we have the default project structure for an Ionic 2 app. Let's walk quickly through each one of these files and just explain them. The first folder is the hooks folder. These are scripts that are run before, during, and after building and testing your app. Generally, unless you're doing some advanced work, you don't need to really mess with those, but they can be useful for preparing a Cordova build, for example. The next folder is Node modules. This is where Node.js and NPM store all the JavaScript dependencies our app is going to use, like Angular 2 and Ionic. The platforms directory is where Cordova generates platform-specific code. So for example, for iOS, we actually have Objective-C code here in an Xcode project. So we can actually open up this Xcode project and test directly on a device or emulator. The plugins directory is where Cordova stores native plugin code. For example, if we have a Bluetooth plugin or a HealthKit plugin to access HealthKit data, those plugins will be in here. The resources directory stores our icon and splash screen that get generated with Cordova to actually become our splash screens and icons in the app. The source directory is where most of our app code runs, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time working in this source directory. The www folder, www as some people call it, is basically the static output folder for our app. Every time Ionic builds our app and generates it, that code goes into this directory. So you can kind of think of it as the root of a static web server. So really it's just running index.html and accessing a few files. You're free to put other files in here, but generally avoid putting files in the assets and build directory because Ionic overwrites those with the build assets from generating your app. Looking at some of these files down here, the editor config is simply an editor config to help you better format your code using Ionic's code standards. Git ignore is a default git ignore, so you don't check in files that we generally want you to ignore, like node modules, for example, which is not necessary, nor should it be stored in your Git repo. Config.xml is a configuration file for Cordova that lets you configure the actual Cordova app. So for example, we disable a few things in the actual native runtime, and we store the plugins that we're using. Ionic config JSON, you generally don't need to mess with this, but it stores some configuration that Ionic reads. Package.json is a node metadata file that says what dependencies your app has. So you can see in here, we've got some dependencies on Angular and Ionic. tsconfig specifies some configuration for TypeScript. Ionic provides a default one. Generally, you shouldn't modify this file, but we may require it to be updated down the road should changes be necessary. Finally, tslint is a linter rule, and linters are basically tools that help format your code or tell you about code that's not properly formatted. This helps work with other team members on bigger teams because you know that you're all writing code that looks the same and follows the same standards, like making sure you're using a space after an if statement. Feel free to modify this, but we provide you some default ones out of the box. So that's the default high-level structure of an Ionic app. We're going to spend most of our time in the source folder. That's where the actual code for our app lives before it's built into a highly compressed minified JavaScript file by Ionic. So the first folder inside this source folder is the app folder. Now the app folder runs basically the initial code that jumpstarts your app, bootstraps your app. So the first file in here is the app.component.ts. So in Angular 2 and Ionic 2, your app is just a tree structure of components. And that means that there is one component at the top called the root component or the app component that is basically the first component that runs the app. So in this case, that component is my app. It's got a reference to a template file here. And then in the constructor, when it runs, it's waiting for platform ready, changing the style of the status bar, and then hiding the splash screen. And then it's also setting this root page variable to be a reference to tabs page, which we'll talk about in a second. But if we follow and take a look at the template that app uses, it consists of one component, IonNav. IonNav is a navigation controller that lets you push and pop pages to navigate between them. Generally, you'll want this to be the root component because it lets your app navigate around. And then in here, we're setting the root element on IonNav to this root page variable that we defined here, which is tabs page. So basically, this is saying that inside the IonNav, the root page is going to be the tabs page. The next file is app.module.ts. Angular 2 requires every single app to have an ng module declaration. And inside here, we define our ng module. We have to list out all the components that we're using. We import the Ionic module, so all of Ionic can run. And then we specify some other entries and providers here below. App.scss is global CSS and Sass to theme your app. We're not going to use that for this example. And then main.ts is a small entry point for the app that tells Angular to bootstrap and actually run your app using the app module that we defined in app.module. The next folder here is the assets folder. And the assets folder is where you'll store static assets like images that get bundled in the build process and output in the www assets folder. Pages, we'll dig more into this soon, but this is where the code for every single one of our pages live. So if we go back to our app, we'll see a home page, an about page, and a contact page. And then this whole tabs UI is a tabs page. So by default, our app comes with 4 pages. We'll talk about each one of those in a second. The next page is a themes page, which contains some colors we can customize. So if we want to go in here and quickly change the look and feel of our app, we could change a few color settings and our app would automatically update. So it's a very quick way to quickly brand your app. Declarations.ts is a file that TypeScript uses to type external modules that don't come with their own typings. Unless you know what you're doing, you can safely ignore that file. Index.html is the root index.html file that gets put into www. It's very important. This is actually the starting point for your app from a visual standpoint, and this kicks off your entire app. The next file is manifest.json. This is a progressive web app file that identifies your app as a standalone app for Chrome and mobile web browsers that support it. So if you're building a progressive web app, you'll want to use this file. It's not relevant for this example. Service worker, same thing. It's a feature for progressive web apps, which isn't in the scope of this demo. Great. So that's the high-level structure of the app. Let's actually go and try to modify and actually build some functionality really quickly into our app. So if we go back to the app, we've got these 3 pages and these 3 tabs. Let's try making the home page actually list out a list of items that we can tap on and navigate to a detail view of the item. That's commonly called a master detail view. So the first thing that we'll want to do, because this homepage comes with some filler text, is just open up the view or template for this page. So we'll go into the source pages home.html file, which is the view, the visual part of the page. And we'll just go in the content here and just delete this content. And then one other thing we can do is remove this padding attribute, which adds a default padding around the page. Notice this is inset here. We don't want that when we're building a list UI, so we're just going to remove it. So notice we save, and the app automatically updates and reflects those changes. So generally what we want to do when we're building an Ionic app is go to the documentation to look at all the components that we have. So go to ionicframework.com/docs, hit UI components, and you'll notice that we've got tons of high quality components that we can add to our app. In many cases, we can just come here and copy and paste code directly into our app. And that's the intention that we have with this documentation. So don't feel bad about doing it. We all do it. So if we click lists, we see a simple example for a basic list that just renders a list of items over here. That's going to work for us. So I'm just going to go and copy this code, and I'm going to go back to my home template and paste it in. And just make sure it's formatted right. So this uses ion list to create a list, and then it has button ion item, which is a list item that it renders for every single one of the items in our list. So those of you who are familiar with Angular 1 will notice ng4, which is the same as ng repeat. This ng4 statement says we're going to iterate through this list of items, and for every single item here, we're going to create a variable called item, and we're going to render this. So if we had 10 items here, this would look like 10 items being printed. So that's basically what ng4 does. And then we have a click handler here, which also works for taps. It's just a holdover from the desktop era. That when there's a click event here, we're going to call the item selected method on our home page, and we're going to pass in the item that was clicked. So let's go back to our TypeScript file for this page. So if home.html is a template that makes the page look like something, home.ts is the TypeScript page, the TypeScript code that makes our page do something. So we're going to go back here, and the first thing that we're going to do is just create a reference for that item selected event. So I'm just going to create an item selected method that takes one parameter of item, because that's what's being passed in here on the click event. And I'm just going to leave it empty because we don't do anything with it just yet. So the next thing I need to do is create a list of items. So in TypeScript, when we create new variables on our component, we need to define them first. So I need to define this list of items as an array of any type. Basically, any object can be in this array, and TypeScript will be happy with it. So in this constructor, I'm just going to create a set of 10 initial items. So I'm doing a for loop from 0 to 10, and I'm inserting a simple object with a text field and ID field. And then down here, when item is selected, I'm just going to do a simple alert and print out the actual item.txt that was selected just to show. So we hit save. Our app probably updated by now. And we've got a list of items here. So we notice that we're printing object because our template was just printing the object. So we need to tell the template to render item.txt, which is the string inside that item that we created. So now we have it printing properly. And if we tap on one, we'll see that item printed out. So that's great, but now we need to navigate and actually display one of the items. We need the detail page. So creating pages in Ionic, we can do it two ways. We can just go and create a new folder here and copy and paste, let's say, another page just to create a new one easily. But Ionic 2 comes with generators that help us automatically generate new pages based on a name of the page. So we use generators by using the G command. So we'll run Ionic G page. So we're going to say Ionic generate a new page, and we're going to call it the detail page. So Ionic will go and just generate this page for us. And you can ignore this warning here. We don't need to deal with that just yet. So we'll notice back in our pages list that we now have a detail page. So just like the home page, we have a template file, we have a Sass file for this page, and then we have a TypeScript file. So what we're going to do is when a user taps one of these items, we're actually going to go and navigate and render this detail page. So to do that, we need to do a few things. First of all, instead of doing an alert here, what we're going to do is we're going to use this nav controller that was injected to our homepage, and we're going to tell that nav controller to push a new instance of our detail page into the navigation stack. So in TypeScript, when we see this constructor public nav controller, that's a shorthand that TypeScript uses to do this.navControl equals nav control for us automatically. So in item selected, we have access to the nav controller by just doing this.navControl. So it's a very convenient way to automatically assign a constructor argument to the current instance of the class that we're in. So when this item is selected, we're going to call this.navController, and we're going to use the push command to push an instance of detail page onto the stack. And we're going to pass this item into it as a parameter. So this won't work just yet. If we refresh, our app is building. We're going to get a TypeScript error. And that error says we cannot find the name detail page. And that makes sense because we haven't actually imported detail page into our class. So to do that, we need to add an import statement here. We're going to import the detail page reference from this TypeScript file. We need to access this TypeScript file from this TypeScript file. So to do that, we need to go one directory up because we're in the home folder here. So .. brings us up one directory to the pages directory. And then we need to go back down into the detail page and then reference the detail.ts file. Now you don't use .ts because TypeScript just knows that you're referring to the TypeScript file. It doesn't necessarily know about these other files. Okay, so let's go back to our app, which should work now. And if we tap something, we'll get a different error, runtime error, caused by no component factory found for detail page. So Angular requires us to declare every single page that we use. So we need to go back to that app.module.ts where our Angular module lives. And you'll notice that we were importing these other pages here. This tells Angular about our page so it knows that it can render it. This is really useful and important when we use ahead of time compiling, which helps Angular take our app and really tightly pack it together. And it needs you to declare these things so it can find them when it does that pre-build process. So we've added our detail page here to both declarations and entry components. Now, if we go back, our app is rebuilding. And if we tap one of the items, we navigate to the detail page. Now you'll notice that it's not printing any information about our item. So to do that, we need to go back to the detail TypeScript file. And in here, this item that we were looking for will be available on navparams, and we'll call navparams.getItem to grab it. Now, just like in the other class, we need to declare what item is, and it's just an any type. And an any type is really just an empty, anonymous JavaScript object. Sorry, not empty, but anonymous. So item is any, we call this.item equals navparams.get. So if this page is navigated to with a parameter of item, we'll be able to access it from the navparams. Now, to make the user know that we got this item, we need to render it back to them in the template. So to do that, we can do item.text and then just add some nice message. So you'll notice that Ionic is just like any other HTML framework. We can use all the HTML and JavaScript and CSS that we already know, like p tags and h2 tags, and just write things out just like we're used to. So now we have a template that actually renders the item text. And now if we navigate, we'll see item 2. Welcome, number 2. Great job. It's as simple as that. Think of every single page in Ionic as standalone, so you can navigate to any page at any time. So when we see this tabs layout, and we see these 3 tabs, inside the tabs component, these are just references to instances of different pages. So if we go to the tabs TypeScript, we see that tab 1 root is a reference to homepage. Tab 2 root is a reference to about page, and tab 3 root is a reference to contact page. If I wanted to change that and do 3 references to homepage, just as an example, we'll see now that every single page has an individual instance, its own instance, unique instance of every single page. So if we navigate inside of each one of these tabs, you'll notice they preserve their navigation state, but we have a back button here on the first one and we don't have it there. And maybe we're selecting item 9 here and item 4 here. But these pages, they aren't tied to where they live. So unlike Ionic 1, we don't have to deal with brittle routing where this page had to be defined by this one URL. And instead, we think of pages as something that can just be navigated to from anywhere at any time. Much more native programming style that's much more flexible. Okay, so that was just a simple example just to kind of prove a point. We'll go back to the way things were. Okay, so we built this really great app, and now why don't we test it on an actual device? That's always really fun, or a simulator. So what we need to do is we'll go back to the command line, and we will run Cordova run iOS. So this tells Cordova that we're going to run our app on iOS. So something else you could do instead is Cordova prepare, and then open Xcode and actually run it. But by default, we're just going to do the Cordova run process that does that for us automatically. So this will run our app in an actual simulator. And here we have the app that we're just building. It looks and feels just like any other native app. We can navigate back and forth. Everything works. And this is our app running on a simulator. So if we had a phone connected, that would work just the same. And as I mentioned, we can go and actually open up the platforms iOS, open the My App Xcode project, and that will actually load up Xcode so we can run our app from there if we like. Some people really prefer using the IDE flow, and others prefer using just the command line tools. So I personally prefer using Xcode because I can just go and configure everything. And something to keep in mind for iOS is that you actually have to load up Xcode once in the beginning to configure provisioning profiles. So for example, you need to set the team so it can load and configure your app. That's just something that you need to do. But this makes it easy to kind of build and test on all the different simulators right from the IDE. But like I said, many people prefer just to use Cordova run, and it's really up to you. So just remember Cordova run and then the platform name to just run it, or you can do Cordova prepare iOS and then actually open Xcode and run it. Well, there you have it. That's how to go from installing all of the Ionic dependencies to creating our first project, running the app in our browser, and actually testing it on an actual simulator. So the next steps that I recommend are to go down to the Getting Started page and check out the deploying guide for the different platforms here. So we have information about Android and iOS, and you'll want to follow these so you actually have everything configured for running every single platform that you care about. Also, take a look at the Cordova platform guide for each platform that you care about. So the Android platform guide will help you install everything that you need for Android. The iOS guide will help you install everything you need for that. And this is just part of mobile development. We can only get you so far at the point that you actually run and deploy your app on the phone, Google and Apple lock that down. So you'll need to go and install their tools. But once you do that, Cordova works perfectly with them, and you'll find that it works really well. So follow these platform guides. They'll save you a lot of time. And that's really what you need to do to go to the next level. So beyond that, and beyond installing your different dependencies, we recommend taking a look at some of the additional things that we have available. So Ionic Native is a collection of over 70 native components for doing pretty much anything that you need to do from a native standpoint. So people often ask, can Ionic do X, Y, and Z native? And my answer is always yes. You have full access to all of the SDKs underneath. And if there's something that we don't have that Cordova doesn't offer you, you can go and write your own plugin. And it's really not a scary thing to do. But the nice thing is you can kind of build these plugins that are cross-platform. So you just treat it as a black box. You don't need to know all the APIs, but they underneath will access the native code required for each platform. So for example, here is the Bluetooth low energy plugin. So a lot of people are building Bluetooth stuff with Ionic. There's a plugin that helps you do that. Make sure to dig into all the different components that we have because we have a lot of them. So we have a components list here that lists some components like the action sheet. And every single one of these components has a more in-depth API doc that lists all the different options and all the different features. So that's what the API docs are for. The actual components list are more for the really quick, straight to the point demos, copy and paste. We're not going to dig into every single option for you. We're just going to show you some of the core usage. Finally, take a look at the theming to learn how to customize your app and change the look and feel of your app. In many cases, all you need to do is change some colors in that core theme file, and you'll be set. So those are some of the core next steps for Ionic. Chances are many of the things that you'll want to do bump up on more Angular specific issues. So for that, we have some resources for common things that people will want to do. So check out our forms resource because forms are always something that are really important for apps, but can be a little complicated. So we've got some documentation on forms. We talk about building progressive web apps, how to use NPM and TypeScript and things like that. We also recommend the Angular homepage. And the Angular homepage will have documentation, angular.io, will have documentation for everything that Angular can do. So if you're trying to figure out how do I do an HTTP call or add a REST API, go to the Angular documentation and take a look at what they have. Really, anything that you want to do beyond UI and native code is probably in Angular world. Great. So to sum up the most important resources you have available, make sure to take a look at the Ionic Framework documentation at ionicframework.com/docs. Here you'll find documentation on everything from all our UI components to how to call their JavaScript APIs to make them do more. We also have a lot of additional resources on advanced topics like using forms and theming your app. Take a look at the Ionic Native docs for everything you need to know about how to use the full power of the native SDKs underneath your app. For example, here's how you'll use Bluetooth, access HealthKit data, scan fingerprints, you name it. Chances are we've got a plugin for you here. A lot of building an Ionic app involves using Angular concepts, including rendering data in your templates, and making things like HTTP requests. So the angular.io documentation will become your friend as you build out your app. The Ionic community is one of the best resources you have to get everything from help to developers to work on your app if you need it. The forum, the official Ionic forum, is the watering hole for everything Ionic. Check that out at forum.ionicframework.com. We've got a Slack channel with nearly 10,000 developers from around the world. Stack Overflow is a great resource to ask Ionic-related questions and help out other Ionic developers. Finally, follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our newsletter so you can get updates on everything from security updates, bug fixes, new features, you name it. We're very active on Twitter. We share a lot of stuff from the community. We'd love to share your stuff. Please get in touch. Thanks again for using Ionic. We hope you find it dramatically improves your productivity when it comes to mobile development and makes it 10 times easier, 100 times easier than it ever was. Let us know what you think. follow us on our GitHub, file issues, see what we're up to on the actual development side, and please just let us know what you're doing with Ionic. We love to see awesome Ionic apps. Thanks again.